Hello and welcome to the Craft Beer Corner. For today's beer review, we're jumping into a beer from Bottle Logic Brewing Company. Hugely popular at the moment, this brewer. Getting a ton of just fantastic rave reviews for whole ranges of beers, but they're quite well known for their really big, bold, inventive stouts in particular. Though today we're not doing a stout, today we're doing a Japanese style rice lager. This specific one is called Hanamachi. It clocks in at 5% ABV. Bottle Logic is based in Anaheim, California. So first things first, label art on this, absolutely a must. It's got a couple of geisha on the front, and then on the back you will see there is plenty of kanji to keep your Japanese inspiration going full strength there. I also noticed on the front that they say super dry, so I'm guessing that this is going to be akin to, say, the Japanese lager Asahi. Super dry, which is well known as a very dry lager, obviously brewed with rice. That's quite common in Japan. It adds a ton of nuance for both aroma and flavor in the beer. I'm really expecting this to be quite nice. This is the first beer I will have reviewed from Bottle Logic. I did get this one from Craft Shack, though I do see that they have tons of beers on Tavour by Bottle Logic all the time. So plenty of places that you can get Bottle Logic beers, but I did get mine from Craft Shack. I also have a Bottle Logic barley wine that I'll be doing in an upcoming review that I also got from Craft Shack. So, label art, awesome. We're going to get this cracked. We're using our nice all-purpose Sam Adams glass today. Should be great for a nice Japanese-inspired rice lager. So we'll get this poured right in. Oh, and it even looks like one. Very, very pale yellow. That is very typical in a Japanese rice lager, and they are absolutely nailing it visually. So we will jump right into the head, see what we detect. Wow, yeah. So this does smell a lot like a typical Japanese rice lager, but there's actually a lot more nuance and layering in the nose on this one. In fact, I would say the aroma in general puts me in mind a lot more of a classic German or Czech Pilsner than it does a traditional Japanese rice lager. But we never know until we jump in it. It smells absolutely fantastic either way. It's going to be a lighter beer. I expect it to be crisp. They say it's super dry, so I am expecting quite a lot of dryness on the palate out of this one. A nice crisp boy to be certain. Visually, yeah, it's that classic super pale yellow that you do see in a traditional Japanese rice lager. And very, very fast-moving, active effervescence rushing up out of this glass. It's got a mix of tiny and kind of medium-like effervescence rushing up, which obviously did help create the head in the beginning, but it also is part of the reason that the head kind of collapsed underneath itself. But the camera's probably not picking this up. Where that concentration of carbonation is rushing up to the top, it is just constantly trying to rebuild that head and then kind of recollapsing it as it rebuilds it. So yeah, very active in terms of carbonation. It smells fantastic. It looks fantastic. We'll get one more sniff here. Yeah, it really does smell a lot like a German or Czech Pils. That's immediately where my brain goes. I can smell the underlying kind of grain quality to it, and I'm definitely picking up some hop aromas coming off of this beer as well. Kind of getting a little bit of that kind of baked good vibe, though I'm not picking up any kind of green apple or fresh apple or any fresh mowed grass. This is very much kind of a grain-centric aroma on here, but without further ado, we're going to jump right in, see what this one's about. Take one. Oh, yeah. Oh, that's very, very nice. That's a very refreshing beer. So the first thing I can say, body and mouthfeel. It's 5%. It's a rice lager. This is not a super heavy beer, but for the ABV range for where it is, it's definitely more weighty than, say, comparative ABV range German or Czech Pilsner. So even though it smelled like it, this actually has a lot more substance to it. In fact, it definitely feels weight-wise exactly like I would expect a traditional Japanese brewed rice lager to feel when I jump into it. It's got more presence, it's weightier. It's still really just, we're talking light, medium light, somewhere in that border. It's not a heavy beer, it's not supposed to be, but it's a lot more substantive than, say, a German or Czech Pilsner, which I'm going to be using that as a comparison point because there's so much commonality between this and those. Next thing, mouthfeel. This one does get quite creamy. You can definitely feel the creaminess as you agitate around the palate. It's not super resistant, but you wouldn't expect that for a 5% ABV beer. Really, it feels right. That's the big takeaway here. The body feels right and the mouthfeel feels right for the style and for the ABV range. So job well done. No surprises here. In terms of the flavor profile, there was a lot in this beer. Again, I'm going to come back to the German or Czech Pilsner. That's really where my brain is going while I'm drinking this. It may say rice lager on the front. It may be called Hanamachi and have geisha on the label. But really where my senses are taking me most are absolutely to the flavor and aroma profile of a European Pils. That's where it's going. And the flavor profile is no different. The first thing that I got in here was a big kick of bitters up front, and we're not talking crazy high IBUs. It's just that's the first thing that hit me was the bitters of the underlying hop bill. Behind that, tasted like a very classic European Pilsner malt bill. So I don't know the exact malts that they use. Obviously, there was rice put in the brewing process in this, but it is noticeable. I'm not picking up any nutty aromas on this or flavors in the flavor profile, both of which would be relatively common in a rice lager, both aroma and flavor profile. Of course, ratios are important when we're talking beer, so maybe rice was kind of an ancillary thing and they used predominantly a malted barley base. I don't know, but I can tell you that to my palate, this puts me in mind a lot more closely to a very well done European Pilsner than it does to a traditional Japanese rice lager, especially if we're comparing the characteristics of this to something like, say, Asahi Super Dry. This is not particularly dry, and that's not a criticism, but I'm just making that known comparative to what it says on the can itself. It does say super dry. I would not call this super dry at all. Indeed, I would call it predominantly quite wet. There is a slight drying effect on the end of the finish, but it is exceptionally slight. Your average European Pilsner would have a much bigger, more pronounced drying effect. Certainly, Asahi Super Dry has a much more pronounced drying effect. But it is nice, it's very crisp, and it's very tasty. So I don't mean to sound like I'm criticizing this beer. I'm not at all. I'm just drawing correlations between what I'm getting sensorily, drawing the Pilsner kind of comparison, as well as the Asahi Super Dry, as that's kind of the Japanese rice lager dry gold standard. But all of that said, this is an absolutely delicious beer. It's very crisp, it's very refreshing, and it's got a lot to offer. So we're going to jump back in for a second sip, let everything re-intensify, pick apart this flavor profile in depth, then we'll talk about the balance in the finish. But on first sip, a very, very, very tasty rice lager. Take two. Yeah, really nice weight and texture. And honestly, when you swallow up front, there's this big burst of fruitiness to it. It's got this very fruity, almost floral quality to it. It tastes strongly of citrus. And yeah, there's some apple quality, so I couldn't pick it up on the nose, but I'm definitely getting in the flavor profile. I'm not really getting a ton on the front of that nuttiness you might expect from the rice, but I can tell you once the initial burst of that fruitiness dials back and everything kind of plateaus and holds steadily, yeah, you can get a little bit of that classic nuttiness that rice in a beer does bring to the table. It's quite nice. And then that kind of opens up into this very grainy, almost granola-like quality. So this is part where it definitely puts me a lot more in mind with a European Pilsner in the flavor profile side comparative to a traditional Japanese rice lager. There is this classic crispness, and yes, You can get a lot of these qualities in a lot of different Japanese rice lagers as well, but maybe they're not quite so pronounced. Indeed, I would say a more balanced comparison to a Japanese rice lager, at least big mass market, would be drawing a correlation to big mass market American adjunct brewed Pilsner inspired beers. So yeah, this is clearly craft and it's wonderful for it. So if you're thinking big box, big Japanese brand, sure, there's some correlations. Absolutely. There are some commonalities, common ground, common traits that you're always going to find in a rice lager. But this is clearly a craft interpretation of this style. It's got a lot more bones to it. There's a lot more meat on these bones as well. So yeah, very, very nice. And there is actually a relatively decent bit of bitter kick up front. If I were to just ballpark IBUs, maybe 20. It's not over the top, but it's enough that you get that bitter bite and you get that nice fruity sense that it backs off, gives some of that underlying nuttiness and earthiness that you get out of the rice, and then it opens up into this very grain and granola-like quality of the malt bill underneath. It's very, very nice. It's very refreshing. In terms of balance, look, it's a balance between what they did in the malt bill and the hops on this. I would say I love the balance of it. I'm not wanting for anything. It's absolutely fantastic. It's crisp. It's refreshing. It's essentially exactly what I expected. Just it's way more elevated, what with Bottle Logic being a very fine craft brewer. In terms of the finish, this is quite a bit longer than you would get on your typical Japanese variant of this same beer style. And really it comes down to the intensity of the pungency of the flavor coming out of this beer. Could be a combination of the malts and the hops, much more so than one or the other that I'm just picking out, but it's definitely longer than your average finish. And indeed, the fact that this is super dry and it's not particularly truncated does actually help extend the length of the finish. So you do get more mileage on the sip. And yes, there is a drying effect on the palate. It's predominantly on the tip and a little bit on the middle, nothing really on the back. But that actually does help give you more mileage and more information, at least in the flavor profile, on the end of each sip. Overall, a very, very good beer. Very refreshing, to be certain. It's nice and crisp. I think this is a well-done example of a craft rice lager. So no more comparisons to European Pilsners or Japanese big-name mass-market rice lagers. This is its own craft animal, and it's absolutely delicious. I'm going to take my time, sip on this beer, come up with my scores. When we come back, we will get this one ranked from top to bottom. All right, now that we've gotten to enjoy this beer, we're going to get it ranked. This was Bottle Logic Brewing Company's Hanamachi, a rice lager clocking in at 5% ABV. Bottle Logic is based in Anaheim, California. So yeah, I did get this from Craft Shack, the Bottle Logic. Plenty of them pop up every day on Tavour. They normally have their bigger, more costly, very much ballyhooed stouts, which I'm sure are fantastic. I have an upcoming barley wine I got from Craft Shack from Bottle Logic coming up in a very shortly from now review. But today we jumped and started my first ever exposure to actually trying one of their beers myself. We went with their rice lager, and I gotta say, I really, really enjoyed this. So before we even get into the scores, I'm gonna say, yes, I drew a lot of correlations between German and Czech Pilsners and also comparisons to kind of big mass market Japanese rice lagers. This is just to give you information on what I was experienced, and if you've had either, kind of the correlations you may potentially make, but this is definitely its own thing. This is American brewed. This is a craft interpretation by an American brewer of a rice lager. It was distinctly its own animal, and it was very distinctly crafted extremely well. This is proper craft rice lager. So we're going to jump straight into the scores. Overall, this beer did exceptionally well. In fact, it nearly made it into that illustrious clump of tiny handful of beers that made a perfect score. In fact, it only missed it by a thin margin. A single category I did not give a perfect score. So we're just going to jump straight to that category, and that was the finish. Yes, the finish on this beer was much longer than you would anticipate getting on a comparative Japanese brewed rice lager. But really what it was on this was not so much the length and what I was getting information-wise. It was this being a rice lager, and especially it saying super dry, I actually did expect a bit more drying effect to dry out the finish. So while I did personally enjoy the extra length of the wonderful flavor palette that kept coming, I would have liked maybe just a bit more succinctness to the length on the end of each sip, a bit more noticeable presence of dryness, which is quite typical for the style, certainly as a Japanese rice lager would be. And if you're comparing the fact it says super dry and Asahi would be the big gold standard, yeah, this was a lot wetter and rounder. That's not a criticism, it's just I kind of expected it to be a bit more crisp, a bit more dry on the palate, a little bit less length of lingering flavor. I don't personally consider it a bad thing, but compared to what kind of the goal and the comparative styles are brewed in Japan, this is a slight deviation. But it is a wonderful example and a wonderful craft beer. I loved it. I did not want to beat this up for that. It's a deviation. It may not be the norm, but what they did was wonderful. I docked a single point for the finish, giving it a 9 out of 10. So that did leave a perfect 10 out of 10 in the remaining 9 categories. That is aroma, taste, body, mouthfeel, head and retention, appearance, balance, feeling and intangible, my subjective thoughts category, and example of style. So the total score on Bottle Logic Brewing Company's Hanamachi is a 99 out of 100, just short of perfection. And guys, look, really, I'm being nitpicky here. I had to rate it how I experienced it and based on other kind of yardsticks for the style. But look, if you like traditional Japanese rice lagers, I highly recommend you try this Hanamachi by Bottle Logic. It is a craft interpretation of the traditional Japanese style. It's not identical, and yeah, it has some elements that you would not typically find in that style, but it's very clearly brewed with very good ingredients, brewed right, and just absolutely delicious. I loved this beer. This is not particularly expensive. I did get it from Craft Shack. They appear to still have plenty of these. So if you're interested, just check craftshack.com and search for Hanamachi. And hopefully you can still get your hands on it. This is another one I might pick up a case just to keep in my house as an everyday, just nice, crisp day drinker to get in my rotation. And shameless plug time. It's been a while since I've worn it, but if you want to get any Craft Beer Corner created swag, this is my Ben Franklin famous beer quote that I have on a hoodie. I have this on lots of different designs. Just go to thecraftbeercorner.com and click the shop up top. It will take you directly to my Redbubble store, TCBC Designs, the Craft Beer Corner Designs, where I have all of my made by me designs on many different types of objects, be it t-shirts, hoodies, whatever it is you're craving, we've got them on there. Check it out. There will be some new designs coming in the very near future as well. So keep your eyes peeled and I will let you know when that happens. Folks, fantastic beer here today. That is today's review. As always, I do sincerely appreciate you tuning in. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. If you want to stay in the loop when our videos go live, just turn on your notifications. Hit the bell icon. It's right next to the subscribe button. Until next time, keep it beer, keep it craft. We'll see you on the next one. Kanpai.